Do you know which country in the world has the most oil reserves? Maybe Russia? No, it is only 7th. Maybe the Emirates? No, they are 6th. Maybe in Ukraine? Wait, what does Ukraine have to do with this? So, this is Venezuela. This country has 3 times more oil in its reserves than, for example, all of Russia, while its population is 5 times smaller. At the same time, Venezuela has a very poor population. Average salaries are currently between $100 and $130 per month. Here is an example of average salaries in other oil-producing countries. Even compared to other Latin American countries, Venezuela is very, poor. How did this happen? Let's find, out. In July 1914, life in Venezuela was forever changed. The first oil burst forth from a hole in the ground 122 meters deep. At that time, Venezuela was a forgotten, little-known country ruled by a harsh man named Juan Vicente Gomez. He came to power in 1908 when, as vice president, he forcibly seized the presidency while the then head of state Cipriano Castro was in Paris treating syphilis. From that time until his death, he acted as a dictator. The discovery of vast oil reserves became yet another opportunity for him to strengthen his power. Lacking capital, knowledge, and skilled workers necessary for oil extraction, Gomez allowed foreign companies to explore, drill, and extract Venezuelan oil. This ensured his retention of power while simultaneously allowing him to accumulate a vast personal fortune. If we convert his personal fortune to current money, it amounts to a capital of $2.7 billion. Roughly equivalent to what Trump has now. Here is a chart of oil production growth in Venezuela. From 1914 over the following 21 years. Over the next 21 years, Venezuela ceased to be an obscure country and became the second largest oil producer in the world. In 1935, the country produced more oil than the entire USSR or Iran, while Saudi Arabia had not yet begun oil extraction at all. Thus, it had already become dependent on oil money, which accounted for 2/3 of the country's income, and 90% of its exports. Although Gomez primarily cared for himself and his close associates, ordinary people also began to live better. The first banks opened, and the oil industry provided incredibly high salaries, around which a service economy could form. Venezuelan farmers left their ancestral lands and moved to the cities in hopes of getting their share of the oil money. This time can be called an ideal period. As the demand for oil increased in the early 20th century, oil exports from Venezuela grew, and their local currency, the bolivar, strengthened. This was extremely important for 2 reasons. Firstly, this made the import of foreign goods much cheaper, and secondly, it caused an increase in the cost of exports. This is called the Dutch disease. Due to a large influx of currency, producing anything within the country has become too expensive, and everything starts to be imported from other countries. Over the decades, the bolivar appreciated by 70% against the dollar, becoming one of the strongest currencies on the planet at that time. For the first time, Venezuelans began to import luxury goods. They received high salaries and had access to modern amenities. In fact, by 1939, the capital of Venezuela, Caracas, had become the most expensive place to live in the world. In the capital of the country, which is technologically behind the rest of the planet, life was more expensive than in the world's capitals. Here are the approximate monthly rental prices in Moscow, New York, Paris, and Caracas. And here is the cost of a kilogram of beef in these cities. Indeed, the comparison with Moscow is not entirely accurate, as there was no market economy in the USSR and prices were conditional. Salaries in Caracas were correspondingly high. Thus, purchasing global goods was cheap for them. By the time of his death in 1935, the country's president, Juan Vicente Gomez, was one of the richest people in Latin America, owning vast tracts of land and maintaining monopolies in many industries, from paper production to meat and dairy products. He created the first army in the country to protect his power, suppressed the opposition, and built a corrupt government. And the most negative aspect for Venezuela is that the methods of governing the country were adopted by all subsequent Venezuelan leaders. The next president of Venezuela was Isaías Medina Angarita. World War II presented a great opportunity for him to reconsider the terms of cooperation with foreign oil companies. He reached out to U.S. President Roosevelt for assistance. Considering that Mexico had fully nationalized its oil industry a few years earlier, Roosevelt agreed and even sent legal advisors to assist the Venezuelan government in negotiations. This culminated in the adoption of a new oil law in 1943, known as the 50-50 principle. Now, the global oil companies that extracted oil in Venezuela shared exactly half of the profits with the state. However, one problem arose. It turned out that it was now more profitable for companies to extract oil from the Middle East. And what did Venezuela do? It influenced the entire global oil market. The country sent a delegation to the Middle East with translated versions of the 50-50 principle. As a result, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, and Libya adopted similar laws. This eventually led to the creation of the OPEC cartel. After World War II, the demand for oil significantly increased due to technological progress, while geopolitical conflicts erupted in the Middle East, including the closure of the Suez Canal by Egypt and the nationalization of the oil industry by Iran. The sharp rise in demand and oil prices made Venezuela even wealthier. Here is the GDP growth chart of the country over 10 years. It has nearly doubled after the removal of Medina from the presidency. In 1945, the country attempted to follow a democratic path. Universal suffrage was introduced, and the first democratic elections took place. However, soon the country's army removed the new president from office, and in 1952, the country was led by yet another dictator, Pérez Jiménez. Here is his photo. Jiménez, like Gómez, ruled with an iron fist. He banned opposition parties, tortured his political opponents, and rigged elections. Despite this, during the rule of Pérez Jiménez, Venezuela continued to grow wealthy. The GDP increased, as did oil production. Reaching 3 million barrels per day, taxes were minimal and regulations were almost non-existent, which attracted Western companies. A large group of local residents with high incomes emerged. Jimena was realizing her grand plans. $2 billion were spent on infrastructure. That's a lot, approximately $20–25 billion at the moment. More than 6,000 kilometers of roads, 200 bridges, and 17 hospitals were built. Jiménez generously credited corporations and subsidized their expenses while simultaneously investing in the army to maintain loyalty. Ultimately, Jiménez's budget began to fall apart. Large-scale projects were plagued by waste, corruption, and bribery. And despite the economic growth, the population was dissatisfied with the harsh repressions and began to hold mass protests. And after the army supported the protests, the president had to flee the country in 1958. Venezuela made a second attempt to build democracy and held democratic elections in 1958, immediately after the ousting of Jiménez. However, globally, nothing changed again. The new president again received too much power, leaned towards authoritarianism, and corruption in the government remained the same. But here is the chart of global oil demand from 1950 to the 70s. Despite all the efficiency problems, Venezuela continued to demonstrate economic growth due to rising oil revenues. Subsequent presidents continued to focus on increasing revenues from the extraction and export of raw materials, which in Daki 1960 led to the creation of OPEC, the first international oil cartel. It originally included Venezuela, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Iran, and Kuwait. Through the creation of OPEC, these countries began to influence oil prices and increase their revenues. From 1960 to 1970, Venezuela's oil revenues doubled each year, and in October 1973, the Yom Kippur War occurred between Israel and the Arab countries. The USA supported Israel, and in response, these oil-producing Arab countries declared an embargo for almost 6 months and stopped supplying oil to the Western world. Here is a chart of oil prices before, during, and after the conflict. Oil prices quadrupled and remained at that level after the end of the embargo. Venezuela began to receive significantly more income from exports. GDP grew by 30% in 1973, and overall, it nearly doubled from 1970 to 1975. However, this growth was unstable and linked to soaring oil prices. The government began to actively increase spending on salaries for the population and infrastructure, but this simply fueled inflation. The non-oil sector of the economy did not develop. On the contrary, due to the overvalued currency, other exports became increasingly unprofitable and insignificant. All this time, foreign companies have been engaged in the development of oil fields, extraction and sale of oil in the country. Here is their list. They had the technology, they invested in extraction, built the necessary infrastructure, and gave a portion of the profits to the state. As a result, both they and Venezuela were making billion-dollar profits. However, in the 1970s, the country's president began the process of nationalizing oil companies, meaning he simply took them under his control. Thus, the country attempted to maximize income through crude methods. As a result, foreign companies completely ceased new oil field developments and any work in the country by 1983. This marked the beginning of the end for Venezuela's economy. Here is a chart of oil production in Venezuela from the 1970s to the mid-1980s. As a result of the expulsion of foreign companies, production fell by half. Also, in the 1980s, due to an oversupply in the world, oil prices began to fall sharply. And by 1988, they had fallen by more than half. As a result, the country's revenues collapsed. Inflation began to rise, the local currency bolivar started to fall, GDP decreased, and real incomes of the population, which had previously grown for many years, declined. Here is the chart of the bolivar exchange rate. At the beginning of the decade, it remains stable, but then it starts to collapse and falls by 10 times. By 1990, such a sharp decline was due to an excessive dependence on oil. The country exported nothing else. The collapse of fuel revenues led to such a shock in the country. By the way, do you remember when the Soviet Union fell apart? This diagram shows what the country exported in the 1980s. The Soviet Union also had a high dependence on oil exports. Oil and gas revenues accounted for 50 to 70% of the country's export earnings, and the decline in prices led to economic problems, which became one of the main reasons for the country's collapse. But let's return to Venezuela. The prosperous population of Venezuela began to impoverish. Here is a chart showing the percentage of citizens living below the poverty line in the country during the post-1980s. At that time, the country was led by the democratically elected president Carlos Andrés Pérez. The population began to blame him and the entire political system for the economic problems, believing that life was better under authoritarian dictators, even though oil was simply more expensive during their time. In February 1989, mass protests began. In 1999, mass protests occurred, which the government brutally suppressed with the help of the military. As a result of these actions, between 300 and 3,000 people were killed. The exact number of victims is unknown, as many bodies were buried in mass graves. In February 1992, Lieutenant Colonel Hugo Chavez led a failed military coup attempt against President Carlos Andrés Pérez. Although the rebellion was suppressed and Chavez was imprisoned, he became a symbol of the fight against corruption and the economic crisis. Under the next president, Hugo Chavez was released, and in 1998 he was elected president himself, promising to correct the mistakes of decades of corruption. Chavez stated that he believed in democracy and promised to respect private property during his campaign. However, he also admired Fidel Castro and Cuba and decided to build socialism in Venezuela. It was in the late 1990s, when the Soviet Union had already collapsed, that socialist China embarked on the path of a market economy, and during the 1980s and 1990s, its GDP grew sixfold, while the Cuban regime, although it survived, remained extremely poor. In 2001, Hugo Chavez introduced 49 new laws that granted the state the right to expropriate land, companies, and any other property in the country, including the oil sector. By this time, foreign companies had returned to Venezuela, which allowed for an increase in oil production. However, the lessons of the past remained unlearned, and the country once again began to seize property and restrict the rights of these companies. By 2007, a complete nationalization of oil production had been carried out, and what came of it? Everything repeated itself. Oil production began to decline again. At the beginning of the 21st century, oil production was still at a high level, although it was gradually decreasing. But then a sharp collapse occurred, which ultimately led to an even deeper economic crisis in Venezuela. But more on that later. Here is a chart of oil prices from the 1990s to 2013. They have increased many times over. Following this, the economies of all oil-producing countries also began to grow actively, including Venezuela, Russia, Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, and so on. And this is the GDP of Venezuela during this period. It grew 3.5 times. The lessons of the recent past were either ignored or forgotten by Hugo Chavez. Instead of saving excess revenues for a potential drop in oil prices, he took advantage of the oil market boom to finance his socialist initiatives. He raised salaries, subsidized food, housing, and jobs for the poor, and also brought thousands of doctors from Cuba. People began to earn well, but it was once again an unstable model. The economy was not diversified and also depended on the inflow of oil money. Hugo Chavez continued to develop what he called the socialism of the 21st century. He consistently nationalized various sectors of the economy. and increased taxes for foreign companies. History, as demonstrated by many countries, has repeatedly shown that such measures lead economies to collapse, while openness fosters active development. Here are just a few of the countries that made similar mistakes but later corrected them. However, Hugo Chavez continued down this path. In 2013, he died of cancer. The economy at that moment was at its peak due to high oil prices, and in the minds of ordinary citizens of the country, he remained a hero. But in 2014, the price decline began, and everything else in Venezuela also started to collapse. Here is the country's GDP from 2013 to the present day. It has fallen many times, and is now at the level of the 1990s. One might think that this is normal for an oil state. But here is an example of Russia. The country's economy also initially grew until 2013, then fell due to falling oil prices, but has now recovered to approximately the same levels. If we look at the economy of Saudi Arabia, it also fell in 2014, but now it is higher than in 2013. The hour is already higher than in 2013. In the United Arab Emirates, GDP is also successfully growing. In Venezuela, inflation remains consistently high. An increasing portion of the population lives below the poverty line. Hugo Chavez's successor, Maduro, continues his policies. Oil production is decreasing more and more as foreign companies have not returned to the country. Additionally, Venezuela has also fallen under sanctions from the Western world.